Good afternoon to everybody joining us. Happy Labor Day to everybody who is here, who is not out, who's doing their part to socially distance while getting educated with Sony Artisan of Imagery, Tony Gale. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to be here.
Always a pleasure to have you. So today we're going to be talking about cameras and lenses. Tony Gale is, of course, a Sony Artisan of Imagery, as I have mentioned. So thank you to our sponsor for today, Sony. And with that being said, Tony, I'll kick it over to you.
Thank you very much. As Derek said, I'm Tony Gale. I'm a New York City-based portrait photographer. I'm a Sony Artisan of Imagery. And today, we're calling it Photo 101, the basics of photography. We are going to go over cameras and lenses, in part because it's one of the questions I get a lot. What camera should I buy? What lens should I buy? Do I need to buy a camera? And it's always complicated. So we'll delve into some of those complications. That said, a couple of things. I'm not going to know everything about every camera. The ones I know well, I know really well. But if there are questions, if I know the answer, I'll do my best. If I don't know the answer, if you want to, excuse me, if you want to email me afterwards, I'll try and find the answer. And the same with lenses, but we'll do our best. And then, of course, as I always say, this is what I think. These are my opinions. It's photography. You ask 100 photographers, you're going to get 100 opinions. You know, they're not right or wrong. It's just what people think. I am also a Manfrotto ambassador, an X-Rat Colorati, and the APA national president. I primarily shoot people in portraits, some editorial, some corporate, some advertising. And I've been doing that since the 90s. I started photography in the early 90s, started photo assisting in 97. And when I started out, I had a film camera, everything was manual. It had the little button battery with the meter inside, but everything was done manually. And when I started out, I would look at things like Popular Photography and Shutterbug and Peterson's Photographic, for those who remember those magazines. And I would look at the 5-page B&H ad from where I lived in Bellingham and then Seattle, Washington. And I'd look at that ad and look at the cameras and try and figure out, what does this mean? Is this the one I want? Is that the one I want? You know, it was difficult to afford any of them at the time, but that was my resource. 90s, you know, the internet was there, but it wasn't what it is now. But it made it challenging. It made it challenging to figure it out, and you'd talk to people and ask questions. But now it's much, much easier. So let's jump right to it. What camera should I buy? Well, it depends. You've got your phone, you've got your bridge, you've got your DSLR, you've got your mirrorless. So obviously, as a Sony artisan with Sony sponsoring, I'm going to be talking about Sony specifically. If you don't shoot Sony, we still like you. In broad strokes, everything we're talking about will apply to anything. The specific models obviously will be Sony, but the basics of it, the understanding of it should apply no matter what you're looking at. So if you go to the B&H website and you look at cameras, you could spend $6,000 because there's a sale right now that ends, oh wait, it ended yesterday. I shouldn't have done my screenshots yesterday, Derek. All these screenshots are from yesterday, and I see that sale ended yesterday. So for $6,000, you can get a Sony a7S III with a 70 to 200 2.8 kit. Is that a good combination for you? Maybe, maybe not. It is a great combination, but it's a lot of money. On the other end, for $100, you can buy a Sony CyberShot DSC W800 digital camera with accessory kit. So that's a pretty big spread. Which of those is right for you? In all likelihood, for most of you, neither of those. It's going to be something in between. You've got your bridge cameras, you've got your APS-C, you've got your full frame mirrorless. You've got a lot of options at a lot of different price points. We're going to go over what some of those differences are and why you might want to spend $4,000, or you might want to spend $1,000, or you might want to spend $500. It's just going to depend on you and what you need. So camera type simplified. We have phones. We all have a phone, I'm sure. Point and shoot cameras, bridge cameras, specialty cameras, DSLRs / SLTs. SLTs are the Sony DSLRs. An SLR is a single lens reflex where the mirror flips up. With the Sony SLTs, the mirror doesn't move. The light actually passes through the mirror because it's translucent. So single lens translucent. And then mirrorless cameras. We're going to go over what all of those are and why you might consider any of them or all of them. We're going to start with the phone. So this is a Sony Xperia 1 II. It just came out. I use the Sony Xperia 1 1. It's an excellent smartphone because it's Sony. It has things like eye autofocus and a lot of really great features. It's got an excellent sensor. Sony makes most camera sensors. So there's a real chance if you shoot something that's not Sony that it's a Sony sensor in there. One of the challenges with smartphones, though, with cell phones as cameras, is that they're good in a lot of light, and they're good for a lot of things. They're with you, they're portable, you already have one. You do want to typically limit it to whatever the optical lens will do. So my phone, you can't really see, has 3 lenses on the back. It has a 2mm lens, super wide, a 4.3mm lens, and a 6mm lens. These are from my rooftop in Brooklyn, so you can get a sense of the different ranges of those lenses. The 2mm lens is a 16mm full frame equivalent. The 4.3 is a 26, 6mm is a 52. And then it does say it has a 2x optical zoom. You want to limit your phone photography to whatever optical range your phone has, whatever that lens has. So if I wanted to shoot, say, 20mm in between, it's not going to be as good as going up or down. So that's something to keep in mind. Phones tend to be not as great in low light, partly because the sensor is so small. And there's a few other limitations. Obviously, you can't change the lens, but it's always with you. It's the phone, it's the camera you have now. Makes it easy to upload things. Then you have point and shoots. So this is the least expensive Sony point and shoot I could find on the B&H website. It's $100. The advantage that this might have over a phone, and I haven't used this camera, so I can't speak of it specifically, is the flash is probably better than on a phone. And it has a 5x optical zoom. So that zoom will let you go in between what the 3 lenses on the phone would do with probably better quality. Again, I can't speak to this camera in particular. But then you could jump up to the RX107, which is also a point and shoot. It's $1,200, so it's a little bit more. This has the advantage of a larger sensor, and we'll get into that in a little bit. One of the challenges in thinking about how to put this presentation together and the ones in the upcoming weeks is that photography knowledge isn't really linear. It's not, here's one step, and here's the next step, and here's the next step, and here's the next step. Step 3 is related to step 1, which is related to step 5. So if it feels like we're jumping around, I'm going to do my best to loop back to anything. And if you have questions, please put it in the chat box or on Facebook, and hopefully we can get to it. So the difference between this and the $100 point and shoot, much larger sensor, better build quality, better lens, more powerful flash, more settings, more features. The $100 point and shoot, you just push the button and it goes. This, you can do manual focus, you can do auto or manual. You've got a lot of settings, and it has a 24-200 equivalent. I have the Sony RX106 that is always with me. In fact, it's right here. sitting next to me. So the version right before this, it's an excellent camera. And to give you an idea of the range on that lens, so 9mm to 72, which is a 24 to 200 equivalent, is a pretty big zoom range. You can almost not see the Empire State Building on the left, and there it is on the right. Then we have bridge cameras. Bridge cameras are sort of the bridge between a full frame or a full professional camera with removable lenses and a point and shoot. They're in between. That said, I know quite a few professionals that use the RX-10 III for a lot of projects. It's really an excellent camera. And for some people, this is going to be the right camera. I fully expect for everybody, some of these are right. For some people, the phone is going to be right. The RX-100 or the RX-10 III uses the same sensor as the RX-100. So it's that same 1-inch sensor, and we'll get into sensors in a little bit. But this has a 24 to 600 equivalent lens, which is a pretty dramatic zoom. It's a more robust body. It's a more powerful flash. Has some settings that are a little bit better. This will shoot 24 frames a second. It has a lot of features that the RX-10 doesn't. What you get for that, though, is a much larger camera. You want something small that fits in your pocket. The RX-100 series may be the way to go. You want something a little bit bigger, but you don't want to carry around a bunch of lenses. Maybe the RX-10 is your answer. It focuses fast. I was in B&H more than several months ago because of everything that's happening in this crazy world. Maybe sometime last year, and I overheard somebody at the Sony counter mentioning that they were going to go on a cruise to Alaska, and they wanted something where they could photograph whales if they saw them, or sea lions, and the glaciers and everything. They wanted everything. This was the camera for that person. I actually went up to her because I can't keep my nose out of it when people start talking photography. I went up to her and suggested this camera. She picked it up, played with the zoom, and I don't know for sure, but she said she was going to buy it. If you think that you're going to do one trip, one thing, and you like photography, but buying a bunch of lenses and having that flexibility seems like overkill, this could be your camera. If you're doing a safari, that once in a lifetime trip, and you think maybe I won't ever take pictures again or only occasionally, this might be your camera. It is an excellent camera. But it doesn't have removable lenses. The 1-inch sensor is still smaller than APS-C or full frame. So everything has trade-offs. Then you got specialty cameras. The RX-02, I have one of these as well. This is also the same 1-inch sensor. So the RX-100, the RX-10, and the RX-0, you'll notice they all say RX, all have the same 1-inch Sony sensor. So it's a very large sensor for a small camera. It's much larger than your phone and much larger than your average point and shoot, but still smaller than APS-C or full frame. So it's good quality for a small camera. The RX-0, is really mostly designed, I think, for video, but you can drop it. It's waterproof. It's got a fixed 35mm lens, 35mm equivalent lens. Sony Zeiss Tessar lens, so it's a very sharp lens. It'll record 4K video. It's an excellent little camera for if you need a crash cam. I did a time lapse last year of the tide coming in at Coney Island and washing over the camera. It's great for that kind of thing. As a just walking around camera, probably not the answer, although I should have put it next to me. It's not much larger than this battery. It is itty bitty. So if you want something really small, if you think I want a camera, but my phone is just too darn big, this could be your camera. And then, of course, the classic action camera, also waterproof, also shockproof. This is designed more to be a POV camera, whereas the RX-10, the RX-0, which some people consider a action cam, isn't really designed for that. the uses are a little different. This is designed so that it can be mounted to a helmet if you're skiing, or a football helmet, or whatever you need, your bicycle. So the design and the use case is a little different. We have the SLT, so the A99, A99 II, a classic camera. I had the A99 and I loved it before I went mirrorless. If you have a bunch of Minolta lenses sitting in your closet because you shot Minolta in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s until Sony bought them, maybe this is your camera. It is an excellent camera. The build quality is great. It's full frame. That said, I would encourage anybody who's looking for a camera with removable lenses to look at mirrorless. While the A99 II is a great camera still, I don't know, as much as I'm a Sony artisan, they don't tell me what they're developing. They don't tell me what they're working on. To me, I think the future is mirrorless. Maybe Sony's developing an A99 III and I don't know about it because I wouldn't know. I find out the same time everybody else does, except a couple of times where I found out like 4 days early. But there is something else coming? I don't know. I'll know when you know. That said, mirrorless seems to be where the development is, and there's a lot of things with mirrorless that you can't do with a camera with a mirror. So mirrorless, and all that means is that that mirror we talked about that flips up and down, or with the SLT that the light goes through into the prism, that mirror doesn't exist. All the information you're getting is off of the sensor, so you're seeing exactly what the camera is seeing. If everything looks purple, your picture is going to be purple. If everything looks green, your picture is going to be green. If it looks dark, your picture's dark. If it looks light, your picture's light. If it looks right, your picture should be right. What you see is what you get with mirrorless. So especially when you're starting out, it's a really good way to learn because you can see in real time the effect that settings have. You can see in real time what you're going to get. When I was starting out with film on an all manual camera, I would take a picture and take it to the lab, and 4 days later pick up the prints. And if I'd done something horribly wrong, that's when I would find out. Much too late to do anything about it. With what we can do now, with the technology that's available to us now, especially with mirrorless, where I can look through that camera and before I even take the picture, know if that exposure is right, is amazing. All right, so we have the A6600. A6600 is a APS-C camera. APS-C is a sensor size. APS-C was a confederation or a group of camera manufacturers. I don't remember if it was late 90s or early 2000s, came together to build cameras under the system. There was APS-C, there was APS-H, and there was a third one that I don't remember. They had this drop-in film. When you process the film, it came back processed in the canister. It was this whole thing. And then almost immediately digital happened. But APS-C is a standard size, smaller than full frame. Some of the advantages of APS-C are you're going to get a smaller camera, possibly a less expensive camera. The lenses will be smaller because they don't need as large of an image circle. So there's some options there. A6600 is the top end Sony APS-C camera. Very, very fast, excellent autofocus. It takes the larger batteries that last longer. Then you have full frame, A7R4. This is the camera I use every day. Larger sensor, higher resolution. This is 61 megapixels compared to the 24 on the 6600. The sensor is quite a bit larger. The camera build is probably more robust. The viewfinder is a little bit better. We'll go into some more details in a bit. All right. Hopefully, if I'm going too fast, somebody speak up. What we come to when you want to buy a camera, when you're thinking about buying a camera, or if you should buy a camera, or if you're going to buy a camera for your parents or your kid, is what kind of photos do you want to take? Are you into sports, portraits, street, travel, architecture, animals, events, everything? There's a lot of subjects out there, and the right camera for sports is not necessarily the right camera for architecture or landscapes. That said, almost any camera can work in every situation, but it's not the best camera for every situation. So think about what it is you want to do and what your goals are with photography, or what the person you're buying for's goals are with photography. I bought my sister a camera, and I bought her a used NEX5N because she wanted to get into photography, but really wasn't sure if she wanted to. So I wanted to get her something inexpensive that would allow her to upgrade if she needed to. My girlfriend bought a Sony a6300 because it was small and portable, but could upgrade and you could get different lenses and was still a good quality camera. So if you're shooting fast, sports, action, you need something that focuses quickly, and you need something with a high frame rate. So in a bit, when we talk about other cameras, we have at one end, let's say the A7 II. The A7 II shoots at 5 frames a second at most. It's a little bit older technology because the A7 III has come out, but it's less expensive because of that. If you want to shoot sports, the A7 II is not the right camera for you. If money's no object, the A99 is probably the camera for you because it will shoot 20 frames a second. The autofocus is crazy fast. It gives you a lot of options with speed. It's designed for fast-moving things to track that motion and to get that focus accuracy and to just get that burst rate. On the other hand, if you're shooting landscapes, the speed of the autofocus and the speed of the camera itself, it doesn't matter if this is 1 frame a second or 20. You're not going to shoot 20 frames a second of the little red lighthouse in Manhattan, especially with the long exposure I had. You're going to shoot something slower. So this was an A7R3, the Alpha 7R3, which will do 10 frames a second and will shoot pretty quickly, but has a higher resolution. So this was 42 megapixels. Now I shoot with the R4, which is 61, because I wanted the image quality itself. I wanted that large file size. And so if you have 24 megapixels, it's excellent for almost everything, but if you want a bigger file, then you need more. How, are you shooting travel? Are you shooting wide angle? Do you need high ISO performance? This is in Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. You're not allowed to use a tripod, so everything has to be handheld, and it's really, really dark in there. So I think this was at 3200 ISO or 6400 with the A7R3. If you think high ISO is important, then probably full frame is the way to go. To just confuse things further, however, if you're looking at a newer camera with a smaller sensor versus an older camera with a larger sensor, the newer camera is likely to be better. Street photography. All right. So this is going to get really, really nerdy for a second. Sensor types, simplified. You've got sensor sizes. So the orange is full frame. Obviously, this is not actual size because I can't control what monitor you're looking on. But this is all relative. So orange is full frame. APS-C is the blue. The 1-inch sensor is the green. A 2/3 sensor, which could be a point and shoot, for example, a smaller point and shoot, is that sort of purplish, and then the black on the inside is 1/2.5, which might be a cell phone size. So you can see if you compare the 1/2.5 to full frame, you could probably fit 60 of those sensors into a full frame. So that image quality is going to be better. All things being equal, and of course nothing is equal, a larger sensor is better quality than a smaller sensor. Somebody out there is either screaming and saying, well, what about, and it's true, there are exceptions, And if that person isn't screaming now, somebody will at some point. There are always exceptions. If you take a full frame sensor from 2008 and you compare it to a 1-inch sensor from now, it wouldn't surprise me at all if that 1-inch sensor is better, because it's 12 years newer and the technology has advanced so much. But in general, a larger sensor will give you less noise and more information. And then we're going to go into lens types. You have APS-C versus full frame. You got different focal lengths. You have zoom versus prime, autofocus versus manual focus. With Sony, you have G Master, G, Sony's Zeiss, and Sony. Then you have the option for adaptive lenses. So focal lengths, and again, this is basic. So some of you may be saying, yes, I know lenses are measured in millimeters. That's great. There hopefully is somebody watching or listening who does not. So lenses are measured in millimeters. The most important thing to keep in mind is just the relative nature of that. So a lower number is a more wide angle lens. So on the left, we have a 12 millimeter lens. On the right, we have a 1200 millimeter lens. So the larger the number, the more it zooms, the lower the number, the wider it is. This is taken from the same spot. Soon you can see that construction site on the left. Soon there will be a building there, and my good test photo vantage point will be gone forever. It will be sad. I'll have to find somewhere else. But if you see that big apartment building sort of in the middle on the left, to the left of it, if you squint real hard, is the Empire State Building. Or at 1200 millimeters, it takes up most of the frame. The reason it looks a little soft is because you have heat and distortion in the air. And the Empire State Building from my apartment is probably 7 miles. So there's a lot of things in the way to affect the quality of the image. If you want to photograph the Empire State Building, maybe don't do it with 1200 millimeters from 7 miles away. Get a little closer, you'll have a better quality image. Then, if you have APS-C, you have the crop factor, which we'll get into in a little bit as well. The crop factor, and some of you I'm sure have heard of this, is the fact that because the APS-C sensor is smaller and lenses are still measured in millimeters, a 12 millimeter lens on an APS-C body is not as wide as a 12 millimeter lens on a full frame body. On the other hand, a 1200 millimeter lens is longer. It gives you more reach on an APS-C body compared to full frame because it is essentially cropping the middle of the frame. That's what the crop factor is, or the equivalence. With APS-C, it's about 50%. So a 12 millimeter lens on a APS-C body is roughly the equivalent of a 16 millimeter lens on a full frame body. Why might you want 12 millimeters? Shots like this in Bryce Canyon, if you don't have something super wide, you can't do it. If I was shooting this on APS-C, this shot wouldn't be as wide. It wouldn't be as dramatic because it would just be the center of the frame. You would lose all that information on the edge. So if you think landscapes and dramatic wide shots are your thing, you might consider full frame. You could, so Sony makes a 10 to 18 that's quite good for APS-C, but that still would get you a 15 millimeter equivalent. You'd need an 8 millimeter equivalent to get this on APS-C, which is really crazy wide. This is 400 millimeters. If you think you're going to be shooting things that are very far away, animals, the sun in Oregon sighting for some reason, sports, anything that's really far away, APS-C might be a better answer for you because of that extra reach that you get because of the crop factor. There is an argument to be made that you could just crop full frame to get that, and that's true. But that said, sometimes it's easier when you see exactly what you're going to get. If you know you can crop later, it's a little harder to compose because you have to ignore things in your frame or your field of view that aren't going to be there. And if what you see is what you're going to get, it's a little bit easier. You can, with the Sony full frames, set them to Super 35 APS-C mode, and it will just use the center part of the frame. On my R4, I have a custom button to do that, to switch between APS-C and full frame. But if you know, I only want to shoot things that are far away, I want to shoot the sun setting, I want to shoot caribou running in Alaska, I want to shoot whales far away, APS-C might be your answer because of that extra reach from the lenses. And if you put a really long lens on APS-C, it's going to be a smaller lens than a full frame equivalent would be. You have things like zooms, 24-70. This is overlooking downtown Los Angeles from the Hollywood Hills, Mulholland Drive. 24 millimeters, 70 millimeters. The 24-70 is a common focal length, but it gives you a sense of what that range is and why you might want it. And again, that's full frame. And to give you another sense of the small sensor crop factor, on the left, we're at 586 millimeters. It should be 600. That's why it doesn't quite match. But I was using a zoom, and I was doing my best to get it to 600. And then when I looked at the metadata, I was in fact at 586 millimeters. So it's not perfect. And on the right, 400 millimeters at APS-C. You can see it's almost identical, and it would have been if I'd been at 600. That's what the crop factor is. So you need a 600 millimeter lens on full frame to get the equivalent of what a 400 millimeter on APS-C would do. And then again, where we started before, full frame on the top, 12 millimeters on the left, 1200 on the right. You can see you're tighter across the board. You're tighter at 1200 with the APS-C on the Empire State Building. Maybe that's great. But you're also tighter on the wide. Maybe that's not so great. Or maybe it doesn't matter. But it isn't important to think about. Big, vast landscapes, you might want that width. If you're shooting architecture, you may want that width. If you're shooting sports, this is the A6300 with the Sony 70-300 at 300 millimeters. So this was the equivalent on full frame of 450 millimeters. So having that 70-300 gives me the equivalent of a 105 to 450 millimeter lens. If I want to shoot a baseball game that I'm watching, maybe that's what I need. I say maybe because, again, everything is, it depends. As I mentioned before, phones and point-and-shoot cameras use full-frame equivalents. Usually, I only say usually because I'm not 100% sure that everybody does it that way. But when you look on a camera or on a phone, in the marketing, they'll usually use numbers that are full-frame equivalents. So they'll say to 24-200, even though it's actually something different. It's just the field of view that a 24-200 would give you on a full frame. And it gets confusing, I know. Then you have APS-C versus full frame lenses. So you can use full frame lenses on an APS-C body, no problem. Totally fine. The lenses might be a little bit bigger, but it'll work just fine. If you put an APS-C lens on a full frame, I hate it when I have typos. APS-C lens on a full frame body, it works, but with caveats. So it's going to vary depending on the lens. This is a Sony 10-18 APS-C lens at 18 millimeters. On the right is APS-C. On the left is full frame. So it is wider on the left, but you can see that vignetting, especially at the top, that dark, the blackness in the corners. That's because the image circle, the area of light that the lens lets through and puts onto the sensor, is smaller than the size of the sensor. For a lens to be effective, the image circle has to be slightly larger than the image sensor itself. So the 10 to 18 at 18 millimeters is almost as big as a 35 millimeter sensor, but not quite. But it's totally fine for APS-C because it's a smaller sensor. At 10 millimeters, the effect is much more pronounced. You can see really heavy vignetting, the darkness in all four corners on the left and none on the right. So this is what happens if you put a full frame, or I'm sorry, an APS-C lens on a full frame body. You can do it, but this will happen. If you put it on a Sony body by default, the camera, unless you've changed that setting, will just crop automatically. It will just switch to APS-C, so you won't see it. And I do have conversations with people a lot that buy a new full frame camera. They switched from maybe an A6000. They put their 16 to 50 on there. And then they say, why are my RAW files smaller? I thought they were supposed to be 24 megapixels on the A7 III, and they're, I guess it would be like 18 megapixels with this lens. And the reason is because it's cropping to APS-C. If you're fine with that, totally fine. And you can do it, but just bear that in mind. You can turn that off, and then you'll get the vignetting, and you can try and do whatever you want to do. Or maybe you like the effect. Here, as an even more pronounced example, is the Sony 16 to 50 APS-C lens at 50 millimeters. Full frame on the left, APS-C on the right. You can see it's not even close to covering the whole field of view on the left. And I think it's actually kind of fascinating that it's that shape instead of round. I was quite surprised by that. I think it's really interesting that the design of the lens is almost parallel to the ratio of the film sensor or the image sensor. So with this lens, it's really dramatic. So you compare it to this, you're like, yeah, maybe I could do something that. I could probably do something about that. This, no, like not even close. You are getting a little bit more information. It is a little bit bigger, even so, than APS-C. I mean, you're seeing more of that building on the left and right and a little bit more top and bottom. But it's a pretty heavy vignette. So if that problem comes up, now you know why. We have zooms versus primes. So that was 1200 to 600. I'm sorry, 1200 to 12 millimeters. I went up on the roof with a couple of tripods because with the long lenses, you have to support it. And the 1200, in case anyone's curious, was a Sony 200 to 600 with the 2x teleextender. So that is a whole bunch of focal lengths. Zooms versus primes. On the top, we have the Sony 24 to 105G, a lens I really, really like. To get that focal length, you could get on the left the 24 G Master, the 28, the 35-1.8, the 55-1.8, the 85-1.8, the 90 macro. There you have almost the range of that one lens on the top. So it sounds like maybe just a zoom is the way to go, right? I can buy one lens instead of 6. Problem solved. Let's move on. Except it's not always that simple. Especially in the past, zoom lenses tended to have less quality than prime lenses. Prime lenses are lenses that have one focal length, 24 millimeters, for example. A zoom is 24 to 105, for example. If you bought a lens in 1995 and you had a zoom and a prime, the prime was sharper. Maybe not 100% of the time, but almost. Lens technology has gotten so much better and the Sony lenses are so good that that's not the case anymore. You can compare individual lenses, like the Sony 135 GM is one of the sharpest lenses that exists in the world, full stop. But the 70 to 200 is a great lens. It is very sharp. So that's not where the distinction lies. It used to be. Now, one of the distinctions is that a zoom has less light coming through. So the 24-105 f4 is an f4. On the far left, you have the 24 GM, which is a 1.4. So what that means is it lets in more light. So you can have either a faster shutter speed or shoot in the dark better if you want to shoot stars. It goes from 4 to 2.8 to f2 to 1.4. So that's 3 stops. So that could be the difference between shooting at a 15th of a second handheld and shooting at 1/25th of a second. 30, 60, yeah, 1/25th of a second. That's a dramatic difference. So that may be something to keep in mind. If you want to shoot specific things where that f-stop is important, primes may matter. And because I'm a photo nerd, and every time Sony comes out with something, I'm always like, I didn't think I needed another lens. And then it's like, oh, well, except that one. I have all of these lenses. I have that 24-105. I also have every one of those primes. And part of the reason I have it is because of that f-stop, because of that larger aperture. I also find sometimes if I'm shooting video, I prefer a prime, especially on the gimbal, because you balance a gimbal to wherever the lens is zoomed to. With a prime, it's easier to handle. Prime lenses also tend to be smaller. So that 24-105 is larger than any of these lenses, with the possible exception of the far right, which is a 90 macro, which is also a bit of a specialty lens. The macro will allow you to focus closer than any of the other lenses. So it's in a little bit of a different category. So prime, zoom, it's up to you, but there are reasons for both. For most people, most of the time, I think the first lens you should buy is a zoom. And then as you figure out what you're doing, there may be primes to buy. That 85-1.8, the second one from the right, is one of the best deals in photography. It's $600, which either seems like a lot of money or no money at all, depending on who you are. When I started out, that seemed like a huge amount of money. Now it seems like a steal. It is an excellent, excellent lens for $600. So the answer, should I buy a prime or should I buy a zoom, is it depends. Everything is it depends. It's like I'm a lawyer. If I do this, what happens? It depends. Can I sue? It depends. Autofocus versus manual focus. I included this because I see sometimes in Facebook photo groups, which I'm sure most of us are on Facebook, and I'm sure most of us know that a lot of groups are not the most welcoming places. And sometimes there are people who have very strong opinions about various things that I would argue at the very least are subjective, and any blanket statement is rarely correct. So autofocus versus manual focus, there are people that will say, oh, manual focus all the way. Professionals never use autofocus. That's not true. Professionals absolutely use autofocus, especially with eye autofocus. It's magic. If you're looking at autofocus versus manual focus lenses, in my opinion, autofocus. Just don't even bother with the manual focus lenses. There's no reason. You can always put an autofocus lens into manual focus if you need it to. There are some third-party super cheap manual focus lenses, but I tend to think they're super cheap for a reason. Just do autofocus unless you have a compelling reason for manual focus. All right, so some of the lens types and differences. We have Sony G Master, Sony G, Sony Zeiss, and Sony. With the Sony lenses, and I believe almost every lens manufacturer, you have tiers of lenses. So with Sony, you have Sony lenses, good lenses. Some of them are better than others. Sometimes that's related to price, sometimes it's not. You have Sony G and Sony Zeiss. Those are pro tier lenses. They're excellent quality lenses. For a long time, those were the top tier lenses. So you had good Sony lenses, and then you had Sony G and Sony Zeiss lenses. They were one step up, better weather sealing, probably a better build quality. They might have been metal. The optics were probably better. They're probably sharper. If you had a zoom that was Sony G or Sony Zeiss, it was probably not a variable aperture. A variable aperture is where it might go from 4 to 5.6 as you zoom. So if you're at 70, it's f4. If you're at 300, it's 5.6, so you lose a stop of light. Excellent lenses. And then a few years ago, Sony came out with G Master. G Master is designed to be the top tier lens. So it is designed in part, and hopefully I'm not getting this wrong. I'm sure somebody will tell me. It is designed in part to be future-proof. So one of the challenges that people have with digital cameras is that they are so much better than 35 millimeter cameras, 35 millimeter film cameras ever were. And lenses that were great on a 35 millimeter film camera from 1995, if you put it on a modern full frame digital camera, they're often garbage. They're just not sharp. They were sharp enough for film, but they're not sharp enough for the high megapixel, super high quality digital cameras we have now. The Sony G Masters are designed so that as that image technology improves and that image sensor technology improves, those G Master lenses are still good, so that you're not buying new lenses again in 10 years. That's part of what the design is. They're designed to have better bokeh. They're really, really good lenses. Are you going to go wrong buying Sony G or Sony Zeiss? No, of course not. Are you going to go wrong buying Sony? It just straight up Sony? Probably not. It just depends on what you need. I will say one of the pieces of advice I got from a photographer when I was assisting in Seattle was buy the best equipment you can afford. And I have plenty of times when I was younger bought cameras or lenses, mostly lenses, because they were inexpensive, that turned out to be a mistake. You buy that cheap zoom, and then all of a sudden you realize it's just not that sharp, or the build quality is not good. It's more likely to break. You know, maybe it's plastic instead of metal, or the lens mount is plastic. Bear that in mind. You obviously all have to balance how often you can use the camera, what you can afford. If you're taking pictures 3 times a year, the build quality is probably not that big of an issue for you. If you're shooting every day, it is. I know people who don't even put caps on their lenses and just beat the living daylights out of their gear. They need stuff where the build quality is super high, or every 2 weeks they'd be sending it in for repairs. If it's your grandmother and she leaves it on the table except when the grandkids are over, the build quality isn't as important. What just happened? Whoops, I clicked on the wrong thing. And there is a huge range. There's a huge range of what's available and at different price points. So this are the 5, I believe there's only 5, Sony 50 millimeter interchangeable lenses that are available. So you have on the upper left, 51.8 for APS-C. Then you have a 51.8 in the middle for full frame. You have a 52.8 macro on the upper right, 55 1.8 on the bottom left, and a 51.4 on the bottom right. It's 4 50 millimeter lenses. Which one do you buy? Well, if you just look at the pricing, none of it makes any sense, right? $348 for the APS-C, but $248 for the full frame, again, based on pricing from a couple of days ago. None of this pricing should be assumed to be current or accurate. Things change all the time. $548 for the macro, $1,000 for the 55.18, and yet the 50.18 is $250, or $1,500 for the 51.4. This is where optical quality the f-stop range, build quality, and some other things come into play. Part of the reason that the 51.8 for APS-C is more expensive than the full frame equivalent is because the 51.8 for APS-C has optical steady shot built in. So that lens has the stuff built in to help with image stabilization. The 51.8 in the middle for full frame does not have optical stabilization built into the lens. All of the current Sony full frame bodies have image stabilization built into the camera itself. So the lenses don't necessarily need it. Some of them still do, and when they do, they'll work in tandem to do image stabilization, which allows you to, say, handhold at a lower shutter speed than you would otherwise be able to. But it's less important to have it in the lens if that body has it. With the APS-C bodies, fewer of them have steady shot built into the body. So for them, having a 51.8 with steady shot built into the lens is really helpful. That's part of the reason it's more expensive. The reason that the macro on the far right is $548 is a macro is a little bit more specialized, even though it's a 2.8 instead of a 1.8, so it lets in less light. The optics are different, so it can focus much, much closer. So if you want to photograph your flower from an inch away, you need a macro. The two on the bottom, both full frame, are Sony Zeiss. So the bodies are metal. There's better weather sealing. What the weather sealing means is that if you're out shooting in the rain, you're less likely to have something go wrong. There's sealing in the joints in the gaskets so that water's less likely to get in. There is no way to guarantee with any camera system that no water will get in ever, but it's designed to make that less likely. Dust is less likely to get in, water's less likely to get in. The build quality itself is more robust. They're metal, not plastic. The image quality is going to probably be better. So the one on the left, the 1.8, is $500 less than the one on the right. Part of the reason for that is the one on the right will go to 1.4 instead of 1.8. So it will let in more light. And it has the physical aperture ring, which especially a lot of video people like. So there's a huge range, and there's a reason for it. And in general, you have better image quality with the more expensive lens, and you have better build quality with the more expensive lens. You also, depending on the lens, may have faster autofocus. And depending on the lens, you may or may not have image stabilization built in. I know it can get confusing when you're like, why? So with all that, what camera and what lens? It still depends. So I'm going to quickly go through, see my caveat, screenshots from the B&H website on 9/6/2020. Prices and specials will change over time. You've got your RX0. You've got your action cam. We talked about those. Now we've got your point and shoots. If you're going to get a point and shoot, don't buy the $100 one. That's my advice. You could buy the original RX100, which is $400 now. Or you've got the RX107, which is $1,200. Is the 7 better? Yes. It'll shoot 4K. The lens will do 24-200 instead of a 24-70 equivalent. It's got a pop-up viewfinder. It's got slow and quick. The image quality is going to be better. The autofocus is going to be better. The buffer is going to be larger. There's a lot of things that are better about that camera. But maybe you don't care. Or maybe $400 seems reasonable and $1,200 doesn't. None of that matters. You need to buy what's right for you. Just because somebody like me tells you this one is better doesn't mean it's better for you necessarily. You have to look at it and decide what makes sense for you. That $400 RX100 is a great camera. I had one for years. A friend of mine has now been borrowing it for the last 3 years since I upgraded. It's an excellent camera. The RX107 is better. Whether or not it's better enough is up to you. You have the RX10 bridge camera. You have the RX10 IV on the top, the RX10 III on the bottom. The single biggest difference between those is the RX10 IV is a 24-600 millimeter equivalent, And the RX10 III is, I believe, a 24 to 200 millimeter equivalent. So if you're shooting things very far away, wildlife, for example, the RX10 IV is probably the answer for $200 more. But again, it just depends on what you need. Then you have the world of APS-C. So on the upper left, the 6600, then the 6400, then the 6100, then the 6000. The 6000 sells really well for a reason. It's $450, or it was yesterday. 24 megapixels. In fact, these are all 24 megapixels. They're all good cameras, but if you compare, say, the 6000 to the 6600 has a larger battery, so it will last longer. It has faster autofocus. It will shoot 4K video. The 6000 will not, although the other three will. Better image quality, better viewfinder, better screen. Everything about it is better, but you pay for those differences. The 6400 has a better viewfinder and screen than the 6100. Those are the main things. But for like your parents, if you want to buy them a camera, the 6000 is probably fine. If you're never going to shoot video and you're only occasionally taking pictures, 6000 may be your camera. If you really like photography, or if you want to shoot video, one of the others is going to be better. You'll also see that all of them, the 6100, the 6400, and the 6600, all have a screen that flips up over the top of the camera. So if you want to do vlogging, those are the cameras. The 6000 screen will not flip up that way. So you can't see yourself if you're filming yourself. I'm rushing a little because I just realized it's almost 4. Then we have the mirrorless family. So we have the A9 II, the A7R4, the A7 III, the A7S III. These are the most current full-frame cameras. A9 II, sports, wildlife, excellent camera, really fast autofocus, 20 frames a second, great camera, super robust. If you're a photojournalist, that might be your camera. A7R4 is what I use. Super high resolution, excellent autofocus. I use it for portraits and landscapes. Because the resolution is so high, some people would prefer the A7 III because it's 24 megapixels instead of 61. The 24 megapixels means it's smaller files, but if you're just putting them online, that probably doesn't matter. Excellent camera, good autofocus, really good camera. The A7S III, bottom right, which is slated to begin shipping on Thursday, September 24th, according to the B&H website there. I'm looking forward to it. I've pre-ordered one. Is 12 megapixels. So it's much lower resolution. It's designed that way in part to be more sensitive to light. Lower resolution gives you bigger photo sites, which should be better in low light. It's also designed more for video. So it'll do 120 frames per second in 4K. 240 frames per second in HD. Excellent camera. I got to play with it for a couple of days. I can't wait to have one. So which of those makes sense for you? Hard to say. The 7 III is probably the one that is the more, I'm not sure what I need, but I want a full frame. That's probably the one that most people get. The A9 II and the A7S III, you're buying because you know you need that. The R4, you're buying because you want more resolution and a better screen and a better viewfinder. And then I mentioned that I suggest everyone start with a zoom as their first lens. So on the left, we have the full frame standard zooms. On the right, we have the APS-C standard zooms. Standard zooms are roughly 24 to 70-ish equivalents. So you have the kit lens, which is the 2870. You have the 2470 GM, and you have the 24 to 105 G on the left, and then the 1650 kit lens, 1655, 2.8 G, and the Sony Zeiss 16 to 70. In general, I would eliminate that top row. You are going to be much happier with the sharpness and the build quality if you just go to the second or third one down. That said, it may not be a big enough difference to you, and that's fine. The build qualities are going to be better because they're G and GM and Sony Zeiss, so they're going to be sharper, better build quality. But you buy whatever makes sense for you. Plenty of people buy the top ones and are happy. All right, I rushed that a little bit at the end. Derek, do we have any questions?
Yes, we sure do. A lot of situational stuff. So we'll start with Leslie, who's joining us from Facebook, who has a recent interest in astro and night photography and has been looking at a used A7 II with a 60 to 50, I'm sorry, 16 to 50 2.8. Thoughts appreciated. If you have any feedback for astro and night photography on that setup.
The 16 to 50 2.8. If I'm not familiar with that. If it's a 16 to 50 2.8, sorry, I'm trying to. I will say this actually. For astro, remember when I said a minute ago everybody should start with a zoom? That's the problem with using broad blanket statements like that. Everyone shouldn't start with a zoom. Most people should start with a zoom. For astrophotography, I would not start with a zoom because you want the largest aperture possible. So for Leslie, I would look at a fixed lens with a larger aperture than 2.8 because you're going to want to let in as much light as possible. There's a 1.8, you might look at that. I'm not sure, I'm less familiar with the APS-C lenses, so I'm not sure what else is available, but I would look at that. The A7 II is a fine camera. It's a good camera. Because it's a little older, it uses the W battery instead of the Z battery. So if you're doing astrophotography and you're using really long exposures, having that smaller battery could be an issue. You can power the camera externally with a battery pack, so it could be fine. But the A7 II is a great camera. It's certainly inexpensive. If you're looking at buying one used, make sure it's a good price because new, they're about $1,000 right now. And then whether or not that lens makes sense for you, I'm not familiar with the 16 to 50 2.8. I didn't realize there was one.
I'm
But
thinking Leslie might have probably meant the 16 to 55.
Okay.
That's what I'm guessing. Probably meant the 16 to 55.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think there's a.
Yeah, that's a newer lens and it's a good lens, but you might consider a fixed lens, a prime lens that's faster.
And sticking with the A7s, Barbara has a question. So Barbara is asking specifically for viewing photos on a computer monitor and not printing. Doesn't have any intention of blowing the pictures up, just for online viewing. Going from an A7 III to an A7 R3 or an A7 R4, if there would be a huge difference noticed.
No, I don't think so. If you're just looking at them, if you're not zooming in and you're not cropping and you're looking just on a computer monitor, I mean, honestly, I don't think you're going to see, you might see a tiny bit difference, but not a dramatic difference.
And Kirsten is asking about stop motion animation and street photography. Kirsten, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Tony doesn't know the Olympus lineup like he knows the Sony. So she said either regarding Sony or the Olympus. So we'll stick with Sony.
Yeah, I know that Olympus makes cameras. That's the extent of my Olympus knowledge.
So let's address the question this way. So Kirsten is asking about specifically using a camera for stop motion animation and street photography. If you can point her in the right direction as far as type of camera, or what you would be looking for in a camera to tackle both of those.
So I would definitely do something with interchangeable lenses. But beyond that, I think honestly, almost anything. I don't think for street photography, autofocus is a little bit more important. For stop motion, it's not important at all because you're not going to do that in autofocus. So I would look at, depending on your budget, maybe the 6100 is the answer, or maybe the A7 II or A7 III is the answer. Just because you've got that range. But for stop motion, I would still go with something with removable lenses, but there's nothing specific about a super expensive camera or less expensive camera that's gonna make a dramatic difference to you, I don't think. Just to plug my podcast, though, if you go back if you look for Colette Perry, who was on my podcast, she does stop motion stuff for big brands and talks a little bit about her process.
Interesting. And Grant is asking about the new RX10. If you have any idea when the 5 will be out, if you have any inklings about if the macro features will be any better.
I have no idea. And well, first I'll say if I knew, I couldn't say, but I don't know. The only people that know, probably, unless it's coming soon, are engineers and people in Japan. When something is close, certain people in in the United States will know, and there are certain ambassadors, artisans, or collective that they might send one to test. But unless you're one of those people, you don't know. Anybody who speculates is just guessing.
Well said. And AK is asking entry-level full frame, A7 II versus A7 III.
If you can afford the A7 III, the 3, no question. The 3 is a better camera. The autofocus is better. The battery life is better. The screen is better. The video features are better. The eye autofocus is better. Everything about it is better. The reason to go with the A7 II is because none of that matters to you. That could be. Or if price is more of an issue, which is also quite reasonable. None of us are made of money. At least I'm not. Maybe you are, Derek.
Still waiting for it. Now, I do want to just bring something out. There was a question that came in while Tony was going over stuff, and I typed a response, but I do want to mention it because it is something that a lot of people ask about, and especially when you get into various types of specialized lenses like tilt shifts and all of that. There was a question about macro lenses, about why someone would choose a macro lens. And it's funny, I actually just did a photo shoot yesterday and I shot it entirely on a macro lens. And a macro lens is one of my favorite portrait lenses to use. You can get close, very good with detail. Depending on the focal length, it can make for a very good all-around or portrait lens. So if there's anything you want to expound upon, Tony, I mean, I've always found a lot of people misperceive macro lenses, that they can only be used for macro, kind of like how a tilt shift gives a sort of effect that won't make for an all-around use type of lens and more of a specialized lens. But macro lenses, I see it as more of an added bonus that it can do macro, but depending on the focal length of the lens, you can use it as an all-around.
I agree with that. I have the 90 macro, and it's a great portrait lens. I will say macro lenses are sometimes slower to focus. So if you need speed, they're probably not the answer. But there's no reason at all, if you think you need a macro lens occasionally, not to get one and use it. If you're going to do that, think about what focal length makes sense. Sony has a 50 macro and a 90 macro. If you shoot portraits, the 90 macro is probably the answer for you. It's also crazy sharp. It's such a good lens. But if you never shoot portraits, the 50 macro is cheaper. Maybe that's the answer. But there's no reason that you can't use a good macro for anything else you would use that focal length for. They're excellent lenses.
Definitely. So as we said earlier, we are doing another 3 weeks of this. So Tony's going to be going in.
But expanding the next topic, not just this one again.
Yes, exactly. We are 3 weeks, another 3 weeks of intro. So for those of you who are beginners and have questions, or people who are looking to brush up, but we are going into composition. We're going into lighting, and I forgot what we're doing next week. Do you have it in front of you, what we're doing next week?
Shutter speeds, ISO, white balance, the different settings, program, aperture, shutter, manual, auto, what all that stuff means.
There you go. Perfect. And actually, we just had 2 more quick questions sneak in. So
Sure.
if I may,
of course.
Let's see. If low equipment weight is important, should I stick to APS-C? So Natasha's asking about APS-C, if you could just run into a quick benefit for why people would want APS-C just further than what we had talked about earlier.
Sure, size and weight is a reason for sure. The cameras and the lenses will both be smaller. Um, and if weight and size is really important, then absolutely that makes sense. Uh, it would still depend on what you're shooting. If for some reason you want size and weight to be small, but you really need that larger sensor, then it's more complicated. But let's say you're going to do a through hike of the Appalachian Trail, APS-C is probably what you're going to want to go with.
Do you find, Tony, that there's a stigma attached, and is it rightfully so or not, to APS-C cameras that, you know, as far as from a professional standpoint, where people are like, well, if I'm not going professional, I don't need APS-C, or if I'm going professional, oh heck no, I can't shoot an APS-C.
Do I think that there's a stigma? Yes, I do. That said, clients don't care. They don't know. I mean, I shouldn't always say that. I have occasionally had people be like, "Oh, you have this camera," and they know all about it. But for the most part, nobody cares. The client doesn't care. Other photographers are going to tell you that something is right or something is wrong. But for the most part, if anybody uses absolute terms, maybe they're not somebody you should listen to that much. If the camera works for you, it works for you. I mean, I know people, I've done professional jobs with my RX 100 because I just needed something really small and light, and that's a 1-inch sensor. I do think all things being equal, full frame is going to give you the best quality, but you may not notice that quality difference. If you're doing 4x6 prints, no one is going to see the difference between you shooting it with the the RX 10. You're probably not even going to see the difference between that and the A7R4. Maybe you will, but if the deliverables are small, and the APS-C cameras are great. If APS-C makes you happy, if it gives you what you need, it's fine. It's not going to make you any less professional.
Definitely. Well said. And our final question of the afternoon, for taking video longer than 1 hour, is the A7S III going to be something that is going to get you there?
Yes. So the newer Sony cameras, I'm not sure when this happened. I think maybe it was the 6400. There used to be a tax rule, I believe, in Europe that limited non-video cameras to 29 minutes and 59 seconds. And that rule went away a year or a year and a half ago or something. And so the Sony cameras after that don't have that artificial limit. So they'll record until the battery dies, the camera overheats, or you run out of card space. With most of the newer cameras, the camera's not going to overheat unless you're out like in Las Vegas in 110 degrees in direct sun. So any of the newer cameras should be able to handle that. The only trick there is you need to make sure your card is big enough. And for an hour, any of the batteries should be fine, but you can run to external power if you need to.
Perfect. Well, Tony, thank you again. Thank you to our sponsor, Sony. As I said, we will be back with the next round of this, which we're going to dive a little bit more into some elements that will enhance your image making. So definitely don't miss that. I did drop in the Q&A where you can register for the upcoming classes. So on the B&H website, as usual, the Event Space website. And if you did miss anything in this, it will be archived on the B&H Event Space Facebook page and our livestream.com page, which is livestream.com/BH Event Space. So, Tony, thank you again. We will catch you next time, and we'll catch all of you next time on another rendition of the B&H Virtual Event Space.